This is slide 7 of our Imperialism unit, and we turn our attention now back to some problems in the Caribbean. Right? Let's start with Puerto Rico. We take that right at the end of the war, former Spanish colony, and if you look at the map here, there is the island of Puerto Rico right there, little rectangle looking thing. There's Cuba, just for a point of reference. There's Florida. All right, so Cuba, real close to the U.S. Puerto Rico, right there. Okay, this is a this presents to be a problem because after the excitement of the Spanish being driven out wears off, the Puerto Ricans start to resent U.S. influence. Okay? In 1900. The U.S. Congress passed what's called the Foraker Act. Foraker Act. It gives Puerto Ricans a limited degree of popular government. A limited degree of popular government, meaning that they can make most of their own decisions, but not all of them. Right? Some of their government decisions, some of their foreign decisions, things like that, are going to have to be approved by the United States. The U.S. will still control them. They're going to become a territory of the U.S., so they can decide most of their own things on their own, but when it comes to big items, big things, the U.S. is going to have to approve those. They got U.S. citizenship in 1917, but they don't get full self-rule, meaning that Puerto Rico has a representative in Congress, but it's a non-voting representative. They have no say, which upsets them still today. Every now and then there's talk of Puerto Ricans wanting statehood, full U.S. citizenship, becoming a state. They don't necessarily want to be free of the U.S. and independent, but a lot of them would like U.S. Statehood. Right? Now, with the takeover of Puerto Rico and the passage of the Foraker Act and all that, we have a question that comes up. Okay? Constitution versus the flag. Okay? And the question becomes, does the Constitution follow the flag? Meaning, wherever there's a U.S. flag flying, let's say in Puerto Rico or in the Philippines or in Guam, wherever there's a U.S. flag flying, does the Constitution apply there? Meaning, do those people get all the rights of full U.S. citizens living in the United States? Okay. It's a good question because not all these places have the same rights as others. So the question makes its way to the Supreme Court. And in 1901, the Supreme Court will decide in what are called the insular cases that no, the Constitution does not follow the flag. Just because you are living under an American flag does not mean that you have all the same rights as a U.S. citizen living in the United States. And you're just going to have to get used to it. If you don't like it, there's really nothing you can do about it because the Philippines aren't strong enough to fight back against the U.S. Puerto Rico is not strong enough to fight back against the U.S. These people just have to learn to like it. You are subject to American rule, but you do not enjoy all American rights. So the Supreme Court sort of decides what the territorial status will be if you're a territory of the United States. So sorry about your luck. You got taken over and you're going to have to live with it. Right? Now, let's turn our attention to Cuba because we have some issues to work out here too. Excuse me. An American military government comes in after Spain is driven out, and we stay long enough to help them get their own government up and running. We'll help them rebuild their city, their farms, and so forth, pass some very badly needed reforms. But we do honor the Teller Agreement. The United States withdrew from Cuba in 1902, and Cuba became its own independent country. Welcome to the world, Cuba. Congratulations. However, there's a catch here. We agreed to leave and honor the Teller Amendment if the Cubans would write into their new constitution what was called the Platt Amendment. Okay? And the Platt Amendment is very important here for long-term relations with Cuba. And it's going to say four things. Excuse me. The Cubans are going to have to do four things here if they want us to leave and them to get their independence. First, the Platt Amendment says, number one, Cuba could not negotiate treaties that might compromise their independence. You can't negotiate a treaty with another country if it's going to mean you're at risk of losing your independence to them. Okay? So be careful who you negotiate treaties with and what they are. Because if you're in danger of being taken over by that other country, number two kicks in. Number two says that the U.S. could intervene with troops when we see fit. So if there is an uprising in your country that might compromise your independence, we can send troops to Cuba to put the uprising down. If another country shows up and starts showing an interest in you, we can send troops to drive that other country out. So whenever the U.S. wants to send troops to Cuba, we can. Number three of the Platt Amendment says that Cuba could not take on debt that they can't pay back. So you can't borrow so much money from another country that you can't pay it back. Let's say, Cuba wants to borrow $5 million from Great Britain. Well, if they can't pay back $5 million, then Great Britain is going to come over here and take it. And the last thing we want is another European country coming into the Caribbean trying to take over these islands. So if you can't pay back these loans, don't take them. We'll give you a loan. Okay? Because we'd rather them owe us than Europe. And number four, and this is the big one here, the Cubans had to agree to sell or lease land to the U.S. for a naval base. Cuba has to agree to sell or lease land to the United States for a naval base. Okay? And that naval base, as you see on the map at the bottom of the page here, would become Guantanamo Bay, U.S. Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay, on the far southeastern tip of the island here. Okay, right down there. There's Guantanamo, the U.S. Naval Base. Now, the Cubans agree to this. Okay, not that they have much choice. If they want to be independent, these are the terms. So Cuba agrees to this, and it will be sort of the law of the land for the next 33 years until 1934. The Platt Amendment is abolished. So we no longer have the right to tell Cuba who they can sign a treaty with. We no longer have the right to tell Cuba how much money they can borrow. We no longer have the right to send troops into Cuba whenever we want to. But the Platt Amendment is abolished with one exception. And what's the one exception or the one criteria here that I didn't mention? Number four, the naval base. Okay? That's the one exception, we still control land on the island of Cuba. It's U.S. government land, the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. It's still there today. We still have a naval presence on the island of Cuba. Terrorist prisoners are held, detained at Guantanamo Bay. Very controversial. But that's the one exception. We abolished the Platt Amendment except for that one. We still have a military presence on the island of Cuba.